Hello everybody, this is Dr. Fouladian. Today we're going to start cardiovascular system. And the first part of that we're going to discuss is blood. So reviewing the system, cardiovascular system. So the whole function of the system is transporting of the cells and dissolved material, including nutrients, weights, and gases. So it acts like a transporting system, as it is, for the whole material in the body to go from one place to another place, right? Like when we get oxygen through the lungs, the oxygen gets into the blood and we have the heart that is pumping the blood throughout the whole body, and every part of the body that needs the oxygen can receive that oxygen. Then when these transactions is done with all the tissues, some carbon dioxide, for example, is produced. Then those carbon dioxides get back into the blood from the tissues, and then now the same blood bringing back the carbon dioxide, for example, toward the lung again. And then through the lung, the carbon dioxide gets out of the body, right? So that's regarding the gases, for example. For all the nutrients, like we receive the nutrients of the body through the digestive system. We eat them, then we digest them, absorb them, and all, then at the end they're in the blood, right? Now, if it just stays around the digestive system, there is no use for that, right? It has to circulate all over the body so that every single cell of the body can receive that nutrient. And that's the job of the cardiovascular system. The heart, again, as it is pumping, it's circulating the blood all through the body, and those nutrients that now have been absorbed into the blood, now they can get to all over the body, to every single cell of the body. For example, receive the glucose or any other things, all the vitamins, all the things that we receive through the digestion, right? So that's, as you see, that's the transporting system that connects all parts of the body to each other, right? So that was regarding the gases from the lungs, the nutrients from the digestive system. The same way, if we have a specific gland in the body that has a specific products and hormone, right? How this hormone can get to other parts of the body, again, that product that is a hormone gets into the blood. It absorbs into the blood for the endocrine glands, and then again the pump is circulating the blood, and that hormone inside of the blood can get all other parts of the body, and as soon as it gets to the target organ, the target cells that they have a receptor for that hormone, they just get it from the blood and then do the rest of the job. So that's a connecting and communicating system that connects all parts of the body to each other, right? So as we discussed here, it includes the heart that acts as a pump so that the blood can circulate. It includes the blood vessels that acts like a route, a path that the blood can pass through them, and the blood that is the actual material that is circulating, right? Later we're going to talk about different types of the blood vessel, that we have arteries, we have capillaries, and we have veins. We go over all these details when we're going to talk about those ones. Just as a brief here, as we may need to talk about them, we have arteries. Those are the first blood vessels that are coming out of the heart. So any blood vessels that bring the blood out of the heart is called arteries. Then as those arteries are branching and branching, getting smaller and smaller, finally to get to the very tiny size that we call them capillaries. And capillaries are the place or the blood vessels that exchange of the material is done. exchange of the oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrient, waste, and all the other things. They are all done in the capillaries. So the main job that is transferring of the material is done in the capillaries. If the material circulates, go and back, and then cannot get out of the blood, or the material from the tissue cannot get into the blood, there is no use for the whole system, right? So the main purpose of having all these ones is the exchange of the material in the capillaries. Then after exchange of the material, the blood make a U-turn and gets back toward the heart. And all those vessels that connecting to each other, getting bigger and bigger, and finally big vessels that getting back to the heart, they are called veins. So I just explained it very brief and very basic. Later when we get to the chapter that is regarding the blood vessels, we completely talk about all these different types of any of these blood vessels and how they distribute in the body. For now, let's start from the blood. The blood is the transporter, right? The actual material get into the blood and then transport into the blood. Let's see what do we have in the blood. So as the function of the blood, they transport oxygen, carbon dioxide, and blood cells, deliver nutrient and hormones as we discussed, remove waste products, assist in temperature also. That's another job of the blood. Regulation and defense against diseases through some cells that we have. We're going to see those ones like white blood cells that have. And pay attention to the assisting in a controlling of the temperature as any other fluid in the body. It can control the amount of the temperature by losing of the heat or keeping of the heat. We're going to talk. So here you're looking at the blood vessels, right? You see a section of a blood vessel, a longitudinal section that you see here. This is the wall of the blood vessel that you see that it has some squamous cells. These thin flat cells, these are simple squamous. And if you remember, we call simple squamous that line inside of a blood vessel as endothelium. Don't forget about that. So that's the epithelium that is covering inside of the blood vessel, endothelium. Then inside of that you see some cells, like here red blood cells as you are looking. And then around the blood vessels you have the tissue around that. In the tissue also you have some cells, tissue cells. Now let's talk about all the fluid that we have in the body. All of the fluid that we have inside of the body, some of them are inside of the cells, all body cells. No matter they are inside of the blood vessel, outside of the blood vessel, in the tissue, in organ, everywhere. All the cells that we have inside of the body, including the cells that we have in the wall of the blood vessel, all of these ones are cells. Any type of the cells, they have some fluid inside that collectively we call intracellular fluid, right? The fluid inside of the cell. Now, any fluid that is not inside of the cell means it is outside of the cell. So that one is called extracellular fluid. Pay attention to the abbreviation for the ICF for intracellular fluid, and we have the extracellular fluid as ECF. And also reminding you that intracellular fluid is the same as cytosol that we had before, right? When we're talking about the cells, right? Now the extracellular fluid or ECF, you may see that more common ECF, extracellular fluid, all the fluid that are outside of the body cells can be divided to two parts. If that fluid that is not inside of the cell, it is outside of the cell, is confined by a blood vessel, means it is inside of a blood vessel but not inside of the cells, that one is called blood plasma. If that extracellular fluid that is outside of the cell is not inside of the blood vessel, means it is in the tissue around, but not inside of the blood vessel, we call that one interstitial fluid. That is between body cells, but not inside of the blood vessel, outside of the blood vessel. So we call that one interstitial fluid. Sometimes they call it tissue fluid, but more precise is interstitial fluid, right? Later, when we are going to talk about the lymphatic system, we will see that one job of the lymphatic system is to get all the fluid that we have in the interstitium. Here, this space that we have interstitial fluid is called interstitium. So all the fluid that come here, if they stay there, accommodate, we will have edema on that tissue and then on that organs and all those things, right? So these fluid, where they come from? They usually come out of the blood vessels into here, right? So they have to be gathered from here, otherwise we have problem, right? Those ones, those fluid that we have in this interstitium, the interstitial fluid that we have here, they get into the lymphatic vessels and then circulate, that we're going to talk about that when we talk about the lymphatic system, and then finally get back to the, at the end, near the heart, get back to the blood vessels and then get to the heart and then circulate too. So that's the way that the body keeps all the fluid in their place, the amount that it should be in the blood, plasma, the ones that are outside of the blood and outside of the cell, interstitial fluid, and how it prevents the edema in the interstitium and circulates the whole fluid in the body, right? So pay attention that having enough knowledge about the intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid is very important, because like when you become a nurse, a doctor, or any medical profession, you need to know the relation between intracellular fluid, extracellular fluid, because all the things inside of the body, about 2/3 of our body are fluid, right? And those fluids that are circulate and transporting all the material and keep the blood pressure and all the other things. So that's important to know good knowledge about these fluids and ratio and relation. Now when we have, let's go back here. So here we said that inside of the blood vessel we have plasma, right? Now if we get all the content of inside of a blood vessel, that we call it blood. If we just take blood, when you go to the lab, we take your blood, right? We put it in a tube, lab tube. Now we centrifuge that with all the contents, all the cells, everything that is inside of that. When we do that, after centrifuge, we have this proportion. About 55% of that stays up here, that is the plasma. So plasma makes about 55% of the blood. And about 45% of that includes the red blood cells, that you see that as a red color, right? And a very tiny, less than 1% remains here as a yellow coat that we call it buffer coat. So this buffer coat is composed of white blood cells and platelets. As you see, the whole white blood cell and platelets are about less than 1%. And about 45% of the blood cells that we have in the blood are red blood cells, right? You need to know this proportion. And generally about 55% are plasma. So that's the first definition, buffer coat. What is buffer coat? That's the yellow coat that stays here. What is included? white blood cells and platelets. Now we have another definition that when we put all these three together, I'll tell it to you in the next slide that I got. But here, let's start talking. Let me tell you right now. So when we have these white blood cells and platelet, and we add the red blood cells to them too, right? All of these ones here, so it means whatever we have except plasma is called formed elements. Formed elements include white blood cell, platelet, and red blood cells. But Buffy code is only white blood cell and platelet. Now, after knowing this one, now let's go over every single one of these ones one by one. What do we have inside of these three parts, right? Let's start from the plasma, all the things that we have inside of the plasma. Then we go over the red blood cell, and then finally we go over the white blood cells and platelets. So first, functions and composition of the blood. We have whole blood, means that the blood that we take out of the blood vessels, like when we draw the blood, right? It has everything inside there. We haven't separated anything from that, so we call it whole blood. Whole blood includes plasma. Red blood cells, we call them erythrocyte. What does erythro mean? Erythro means red. Cyte means cell. Erythrocyte means red cells, and it is inside of the blood, red blood cells, or RBC, right? The other one, leukocyte. Leuko means white. Cyte means cell. Leukocytes are white blood cell, or WBC. And platelets. Platelets that sometimes we just abbreviate that as PLT. PLT, right? So whole blood includes all these ones. The fluid and its content, that is plasma, and all these cells, three types of the cell. Now, erythrocytes, leukocytes, and platelets, as we discussed, are called formed elements, right? Make sure that you don't forget that. As you see here, you have the platelets here. Then later we're going to discuss that these are not, each one of them is not a complete cell. Those are fragments of a cell, as if that you get a part of a plasma membrane and put some material inside of that. We're going to talk about how they are formed. Then we have white blood cells, and we have 5 types of them. We're going to talk about them. They have neutrophil, eosinophil, monocyte, lymphocyte, and basophil. And you have a scale here regarding their size, which one is bigger, right? The biggest one is the monocyte, the smallest one you see is lymphocyte, and then you see the lobes that they have inside of the nucleus lobe, and then we see the percentage of them. This picture is very good. It has so many information already here. Like you can say that the neutrophils are the most common one. After that, we have lymphocyte, the second common, right here, and the least commons are basophil, for example. We're going to talk about these ones later more in detail, but make sure that you know the information that we have here too. And then finally, we have red blood cells that, as you see here, they have its own specific shape, and we are going to talk about it. So these are all the formed elements of the blood. Now, after this general explanation, let's start from the plasma. So before centrifuge, you see the sample of the whole blood like this, right? That plasma is not separate generally from the blood unless we centrifuge that, right? So what you see as a whole blood is like this. All the things are mixed together, right? So we already know that the plasma is about 55% of the blood. You don't need to know the range, just know the number that I gave you there first, like 55% plasma, 45% red blood cells, and less than 1% the buffy, right? So that's 55% of the whole blood. It includes these parts. So the composition of the plasma, we have plasma proteins, some proteins inside of the plasma that make 7% of the plasma. These percentage are percentage of the plasma, not from the whole blood. Pay attention to that. So 7% of the plasma is plasma proteins. And pay attention that most of the plasma is water. 92% of the plasma is water. And what's the function? All the function that plasma is doing, right? All those things have to be done through the water. It needs an environment, a transporter, that is the blood, that is the water. So what does the water do? The transport organic and inorganic molecules, formed elements, and heat, right, as we discussed. But the transportation of all these materials is done through the plasma. 92% water, 7% blood plasma, and 1% other solutes that we have inside of the water. The water is clear. Water is water, right? H2O, right? But what about the other proteins and other solutes that you have? The plasma proteins and other solutes. 7% plasma protein that you have here and 1% other solute that you have here. Let's talk about them more. So for the plasma proteins, as you see, we have 4 types of the protein inside of the plasma, and you need to know the detail about them. The first thing, their name. We have albumins, globulins, fibrinogen, and some regulatory proteins. So let's go see over their percentages. Which one is the most common? Which one is the least common? And all the things. As you see, albumins making 60% of the plasma proteins. Among all these 4, 60% are albumin, 35% are globulin, that's the second most common. Then we have fibrinogen. Whenever we say gen, what does it mean? Generator, is producer, is making what? The first part. So this fibrinogen is going to change and produce fibrin, right? So this fibrinogen making 4% of the whole plasma proteins. And finally, regulatory proteins that are less than 1%. It's a very tiny, small percentage. Doesn't mean that they are less important than the other ones. So let's start see what they are doing, each one of them. What are they? So albumins are almost small proteins in size, although they are very abundant in number, but they are a small protein. They are major contributor to osmotic pressure of the plasma. You remember when we talked about the osmosis? We said that when we have a semi-permeable membrane, the water is passing through that semi-permeable membrane, but the other solutes cannot pass through that. So when not all the material can pass through a membrane, when we have a semi-permeable membrane, then a pressure is produced that we call it osmotic pressure due to osmosis, right? Because the water can pass through, but the other material cannot pass. And this pressure makes the drive for the water to go from one place to another. If the concentration of all those other solutes that cannot pass through the membrane is equal in this side of the membrane and on the other side of the membrane, then there is no drive for the water to commute from this side of the membrane or from the other side of the membrane, right? So this is important, that what solute we have on one side of the membrane. And one of those things is albumin. So albumin is one of the major contributor that makes the osmotic pressure by not being able to pass through the membrane. And so that's the one of the major things that makes the water to have a currency, right? To move from all around the body, to get into the blood vessels, for example, and be able to run all the material by blood inside of the blood, right? As you see, 92% of the plasma is water only, right? So we need these albumins to keep the osmotic pressure. And whenever we lose the albumin, we lose that drive. The water is not moving anymore, right? That's the reason we measure the amount of the albumin in the blood. And if it is low, we have to give it to the patient artificially from outside, right? So that we keep this drive for the water to move, right? So that's one big function of the albumin. The other one is transporting of the some material like lipids and steroid hormones, right? So some of the materials, they just cannot get into the blood and walk by themselves happily, right, and go from here and there, right? Some of them need a transporter. It is like which those like it is a blood vessel is like a street. Some of the material can walk into that by themselves. Some of them they need a cab. They need to have a transporter. They cannot walk by themselves, right? So some of those, like these lipids and steroid hormone, they need a transporter, and their transporter is albumin, is like their taxi, right? So they need this albumin as a transporter. So these are these two big jobs of the albumin, and make sure that you know that each material needs a transporter as albumin. The second most common that make 35% of the plasma proteins are globules. The function of these ones, we have different types of the globulins, like we have alpha globulins, we have beta globulins, we have gamma globulins, all those ones. We don't want to go over those details and we don't need to know those types. Just know that they have different functions. Like some of them, they transport ions again, like albumin, they are transported, but they transport ions. They transport hormones and lipids too. Right? So this is one group of them. And some other ones, like for example, gamma globulins, they have immune function. Like those gamma globulins are making the antibodies, right? So whenever we talk about the antibodies later, you know that those are globulins, one type of the proteins that we have inside of the plasma. And one thing, pay attention that the percentage and the ratio of the albumin to globulin is important. As you see, 60% to 35% is almost double times here, albumin doubles of the globulins, and that's important to keep this ratio in the blood. The third one, the third plasma protein that is only 4% of the plasma proteins is fibrinogen. So this fibrinogen is essential component of the clotting system of the body. They can be converted to insoluble fibrin. Fibrinogen is soluble for the inside of the blood, right? As soon as a clotting system activated due to a series of the reaction, the end result is that fibrinogen is converting to fibrin, and fibrin is a fiber that is insoluble. Therefore, those insoluble fibrins, they just go with other materials that they stick to them, and those fibrins themselves stick to each other, make a net of the insoluble, those fibrins together, like the platelets come and stick into them, and all these together make a blood, right? That's the one that makes a barrier in front of the blood and doesn't let bleeding continue, right? That's a protective system of the body to prevent more bleeding, right? So fibrinogen have an essential role in the clotting system by changing into the fibrin. Fibrin is inside. And the final part of the plasma proteins are regulatory proteins, that they are tiny amount, less than 1%, but doesn't mean that they are not important. They include enzymes, proenzymes, and hormones. Those are regulatory proteins. Like, for example, when we talk about the muscular tissue, right? Over there we saw that we have some proteins as troponin, tropomyosin. Do you remember those ones? Like, for example, those proteins are regulatory proteins, right? Although they are in tiny amount, but those are very important. If we do not have them, the whole system of the body is not working. These are like the CEOs, like they are in a tiny amount, but they are making the most impact, right? So they are the regulatory proteins. So these were all the plasma proteins of the body, their percentage, their function, and so let's get to, so far we talked about 92% that was water, 7% of the plasma that was plasma protein. Now let's go to these 1% that are other salts. So those other solutes include electrolytes, organic nutrients, and organic waste. We are talking about the body, so they are organic, right? So what are the electrolytes? Electrolytes are normal extracellular fluid ion composition that are essential for vital cellular activities. Those ions contribute to osmotic pressure of the body fluid too, and the major plasma electrolytes are sodium ions, potassium ions, calcium ions, magnesium ions, chloride, and carbonate, and phosphate, and sulfate. So all those ions are called electrolyte collectively, right? And again, these are very important. These are also regulatory part, but those are not protein. Those are ions. We call them electrolyte. And those are one of the important things that whenever body is in a crisis condition or something is not working well, these are the first thing usually that we check them to see that how is the chemical condition inside of the blood, inside of the whole body. So those are called electrolytes. Organic nutrients used for ATP production, growth, and maintenance of the cells include lipids like fatty acid, cholesterol, and glycerol, carbohydrates that primarily is glucose, and amino acids. So those are organic nutrients that they are used for ATP production and growth and maintenance of the cells. And organic waste, that's what's coming after the metabolism, carried to the site of breakdown or excretion, include urea, uric acid, creatinine, bilirubin, and ammonium ions. These are all waste products after the metabolism of those molecules that we had, organic nutrients, and now these waste has to get out of the body through the different paths that we have, like through the digestive system, through the urinary system, through the sweat, and all those things, right? So these are all the compositions of the plasma as we discussed. Now just reviewing all those things here in the slides again. So plasma makes about 55% of the volume of the blood, consists 92% water, 7% protein, 1% other solute. We talked about the proteins that are albumin, globulin, fibrinogen, and regulatory protein, and about the other solutes that are electrolyte, organic nutrient, and organic waste, right? And this is another slide that's showing the same, all the things that we discussed in a bigger step here. So after the plasma, now let's have a few definitions regarding the composition of the blood. So in the whole blood, we have the amount of the whole blood that we have. For the males, we have about 4 to 6 liters of blood in the blood vessels. For the females, that's a little bit less, that's 4 to 5 liters. Because generally, speaking generally, not every male and compared to every female, generally male have a bigger body compared to the female, therefore the amount of the blood is more in the male generally compared to female. Now, talking about the volume of the blood, if we have low blood volume, we have a term for that, we call it hypovolemic. Hypo means under, low, right? If we have normal blood volume, we call it normal volumic. And if we have excessive blood volume, we call it hypervolemic. And for the blood, we have a specific pH that has a range, a very tiny window between 7.35 and 7.45. You need to know this specific range. The middle is 740, but you need to know the whole range too. 7.35 to 7.45. Why it is so important to keep the pH of the blood at this specific small window? Because, why? Because all the reactions that we have inside the body, they are chemical reaction, right? As all the chemical reaction that you do in the chemistry lab, and you will see that some of them work better in the alkaline, with the alkalines base material inside of them. Some of them work better in the acidic environment, and all those ones, the same is inside of the body. This pH should be kept in this small range so that all the material, all the chemical reaction inside of the body can be done properly. So again, you have here the whole plasma content that we already talked about them, and here you have their significance. You can review them here again too. You have everything here at one place. And also about the form element, red blood cell, white blood cells, and platelet that we're going to talk about them. As you see, the red blood cells' main function is transporting of the gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. So the other material, what about other material? They are done through these, for example, plasma protein. They're carrying all the things, other things, right? But the red blood cells just transporting gases. White blood cells defend body against pathogens, remove toxin, waste, and damaged cells. And platelets participate in protein response, right? Now getting back to the first pictures that we have regarding the amount of the fluid, intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid, we talked about all these ones, and now you're seeing the red blood cells inside of the blood. Pay attention, inside of the red blood cells we have intracellular fluid. Inside of the endothelial cells, in the wall of the blood cells, we have intracellular fluid, and between them we have plasma. And outside we have extracellular fluid as interstitial. We talked about this. Now, let's go over the composition of the intracellular fluid compared to the extracellular fluid. So, difference between the plasma part of the extracellular fluid that we have inside of the blood vessels and interstitial fluid. So, that's the it actually is not between the intracellular fluid and extrafluid. It's between the two types of the extracellular fluid, plasma and interstitial fluid. What's the difference between their composition? So we have dissolved oxygen in plasma. Concentration of that is higher in plasma compared to the interstitial fluid. So we have more dissolved oxygen in plasma. Therefore, oxygen diffuses into the tissue. You remember, the gases are moving passing through the cells by which mechanism? Diffusion. Simple diffusion means they go through their concentration gradient from the higher concentration to the lower concentration. Now when we get the oxygen from the air, it goes through the lung, and then from the lung, inside of the lung we have more oxygen, then it goes into the blood, right? Because it is more oxygen inside of the lung, right? Goes into the blood. Then it goes all over the body. Now the oxygen that has come in the plasma, dissolved in the plasma, comes to the tissue. Now you have plasma inside of the blood vessels, interstitial fluid around the blood vessels. In the plasma you have more oxygen, therefore the oxygen, dissolved oxygen, passes through the cells and get into the interstitial fluid, to the tissues. And then from the tissue, from the interstitial fluid that is around the cells, again diffuses into the cells, because again the amount of oxygen is still higher in the interstitial fluid compared to each cells, because cell has used its oxygen already, right? So that's the way that the oxygen, it just goes from all the way outside from the air, goes all the way to the cells, just by simple diffusion according to its concentration gradient. Now what about the carbon dioxide? Carbon dioxide concentration in plasma is lower than in interstitial fluid. So you tell me what happens to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide again is a gas. Which mechanism helps that to move? Simple diffusion according to its concentration gradient, right? Now as it's saying here, the carbon dioxide in the plasma is lower than interstitial fluid. It means that in the interstitial fluid we have more carbon dioxide. So how does it move? From the interstitial fluid, it gets into the blood vessels, gets into the plasma, right? And pay attention that for the cells that are in the interstitial fluid, right? All those cells inside of them, they have higher concentration of the carbon dioxide too. So in the first place, those carbon dioxide, where did they come from? They come from the metabolism. Like for example, when they use glucose, they produce carbon dioxide. Those carbon dioxide now has been gathered, accumulated inside of the cells. They have to go somewhere. Where they go? They go to the lower concentration of the interstitial fluid. From the interstitial fluid, still they are higher than the plasma. Then they have, from the interstitial fluid, they move into the blood, right? And from the blood they go, and then they get to the blood vessels that we have in the lung. Still, inside of the plasma of those blood vessels, we have a higher concentration of the carbon dioxide compared to the air that comes into the lung. Therefore, how they are moving? From the blood vessels of the lung, they move into the free space, to the alveoli of the lung, and we just exhale them out, right? So that's the way that the whole oxygen and carbon dioxide are transporting, right? Just by simple diffusion. So the other thing is plasma consists of dissolved protein, and interstitial fluid does not have dissolved protein. So pay attention to this difference too. As you see, the plasma has more oxygen and more dissolved protein and less carbon dioxide. So getting back to the composition of the whole blood, as you see here, we talked about the plasma that we have as the 55% of the whole blood. Now let's go look at the other parts that are formed elements. We said that formed elements are making about 45% of the whole blood, right? They include platelet, white blood cell, and red blood cells. Pay attention that red blood cells make about 99.9% of the formed elements, right? As you saw that we made this one like almost 45% of the whole blood too. That's why we call this one 45%, and the formed elements is almost 45% too, because these two other are less than 0.1% of the formed elements. Platelets less than 0.1%, not 1, 0.1%, and white blood cells less than 0.1%, right? So it's almost all red blood cells, but it doesn't mean that the platelets and red blood cells are less important, right? As you saw, this one, it includes platelet, red blood cells, and red blood cells. Now let's go talk about this one. So we start with the red blood cells or erythrocytes, RBCs. We have first a definition that we talk about the hematocrits. For the hematocrits, we have, so what is hematocrits? The definition of the hematocrits, that we also have other names for that, we call them packed cell volume. Red blood cells are called packed cells. When we separate them from the other component of the blood, we call that a packed cell, right? So we can call the hematocrit as the packed cell volume, the volume of a packed cell that we just abbreviate that as PCV, packed cell volume, PCV. Also, we can call it volume of the packed red cells, V volume, PRC, volume of packed red cells, right? So these are just other names that you may encounter. That's good to know them. We won't ask about this. Defined as the percentage of whole blood, that's the definition of the hematocrit, the percentage of whole blood occupied by the formed elements. So you may see that as other way they can say that the percentage of the whole blood occupied by the red blood cells too. So in different places you may see the different definition, but in reality that's almost the same regarding the percentage, because as we are talking about the percentage, the other two elements of the formed elements, platelets and white blood cells, they occupy a tiny percentage. So in reality, it doesn't change that much. That we count the definition of the hematocrit, you can define that as the percentage of the whole blood occupied by the formed element or by the red blood cells, as they are almost the same. So regarding the percentage, I mean. So in the male, the hematocrit, that percentage is 45% of the whole blood. That is about 5.4 million red blood cells per microliter. In the female is 42%. That's about 4.8 million red blood cells per microliter. So as you see, not only the female have less volume of the blood, less liter, but also per microliter they have less red blood cells too, right? That's a tiny amount is difference between them. That is a normal range. So as you see here, a blood smear, that you see that most of the blood is occupied by the red blood cell. You remember 99.9% of the cells that we have in the blood from the formed elements that are red blood cells. That you see that here. And as you look at that here, the normal blood smear, the blood cells have a central part that we call it central pallor, that is paler than the other surrounding part, that we call it central pallor, because later when we look at the shape of the red blood cell, you will see that in the middle, red blood cell is thinner compared to the side of that. That's the reason for this having this central pallor. And here you see the electronic microscope picture of the red blood cells. That's much more beautiful, obviously. And you see that sometimes those red blood cells stack over each other, that we call it Rolex formation here. and specifically like when they are passing through a tiny blood vessels of the capillaries. The size of the capillaries is only the amount of the size the red blood cell can pass through that barely, therefore they happens many times that they stack over each other and make their roller sponge. So here you're looking at the shape of a red blood cell. As you see, this is a biconcave. You have a concave surface here, a concave surface here, therefore it's biconcave area, biconcave shape of the red blood cells. And when you cut through that, you will see that like here is a less diameter compared to these ones, and this a specific shape is important to give the red blood cell the flexibility to pass through the tiny blood vessels. Now, regarding the red blood cell lifespan and circulation, the important thing is that the red blood cell is among the exception of the cells that they do not have a nucleus. So that's a nuclear cells, right? It doesn't have a nucleus. And also it lacks all the other organelles, right? So that's an exception of the usual cells that have a nucleus, all the other organelles. Red blood cell doesn't have them, right? Now, as it doesn't have a nucleus, it cannot reproduce, right? And it cannot maintain many of the intracellular structures that a cell usually needs that to continue its life, right? So it has a limited lifespan, that is about 120 days for a red blood cell, and you need to know that. Now let's go over, take a look at these advantages that this shape and this specific condition of the red blood cell brings for that. Why it doesn't have those ones? It could have them and just stay alive for a longer time, right? Why it doesn't have? So the significance of lacking of a nucleus, it allows the cells to be flexible as it travels through the circulatory system. We remember that it has a biconcave shape so that become more flexible, it can move much better through a small tiny blood vessels, right? If it was a big nucleus in the middle of that, or even on the side, it wasn't that flexible, right? It couldn't pass through those places. And also allows for more room for hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the material that we have inside of the red blood cells, and that's the one that carries the oxygen. You remember the main function of the red blood cell is carrying the oxygen. So that's the main job. Why it loses it for the other purposes, right? So it is dedicated to do its job as it is. So that's the reasons that we do not have a nucleus inside of the red blood cell. What about the other organelles? Like one important thing that every cell has is a mitochondria, right? Mitochondria is needed to produce ATP, but red blood cell even doesn't have a mitochondria. Why not? What do you think? What would happen if red blood cell would have mitochondria? The reason for that, you can answer it by yourself, pause it and answer it. But when you get back, I'll tell you. Now that you get back, it is that mitochondria uses oxygen to manufacture, produce ATP, right? That is job. That's the use of that, right? But red blood cell doesn't want to give the oxygen to the mitochondria. Without mitochondria, oxygen can be transported to the tissues instead of being used by the mitochondria for the personal use of the red blood cells. As you see, red blood cell is so dedicated, it doesn't use even oxygen for itself. It wants to keep all the oxygen to submit it to the tissue's iron. Therefore, it doesn't go under aerobic respiration, right? It doesn't have the mitochondria even to do the aerobic respiration. It just uses the glucose, but it just gets the least amount of the things out of that and keeps the oxygen for the tissue. So here you're looking at the small tiny blood vessels, capillary, and you see that how these red blood cells stack over each other. That's the one that we call it roller, and you'll see that they call it Rolex T, stacked RBC. And that's normal, completely normal, and it doesn't block anything, they are moving. So regarding the hemoglobin and the structure of the hemoglobin, we said that inside of the red blood cell we have hemoglobin. Hemoglobin consists of 4 polypeptide subunits. So it has 4 subunits that each one of them is polypeptide, means that peptide is a collection of amino acids all together. When they are multiple, we call it polypeptide, right? So we have 2 alpha chain, 2 alpha polypeptide, 2 beta polypeptide, right? We just name them alpha and beta, 2 alpha, 2 beta. I will show you the picture. Each subunit consists of a molecule of heme in the middle of this alpha chain and beta chain, and heme is a porphyrin ring. That's the chemical structure that we call it a porphyrin. So that ring, the porphyrin ring, each heme consists of an iron ion, and iron binds to the oxygen. That's the way that the oxygen is carried by the hemoglobin. Iron is attached to the heme, and then we have 4 chain. So therefore, each hemoglobin can carry 4 molecules of the oxygen. So the polypeptide unit binds to carbon dioxide. I will show you that. Then we have a porphyrin ring, and we have a polypeptide unit, right? Porphyrin ring that has a heme that has an iron, oxygen attached to the iron. But carbon dioxide has a separate place for attachment. It attaches to the polypeptide unit. So these two are not interfering, they are not competing with each other. There is enough room for all of them, for the oxygen and for the carbon dioxide, right? Therefore, they're not competing with each other. But pay attention, carbon monoxide is different. Carbon monoxide is competing with the oxygen. That's why when you have carbon monoxide, it comes and occupies the position that the oxygen was supposed to occupy. Therefore, less oxygen can be carried in the blood, and that's the way that the carbon monoxide causes the poisoning. And it's essential that we move those carbon monoxide away from the position that is going to be occupied by the oxygen. So here you're looking at the structure of one hemoglobin, right? We see one polypeptide here, one polypeptide here, alpha chain 1, alpha chain 2. Another one here, another one here, beta chain 1, beta chain 2. Pay attention that these are protein polypeptides actually that are composed of a sequence of amino acids. And if any problem happens in those sequences of amino acids, the polypeptide chains cannot be completely functional, and that's one of the reasons that we may have a disease. We call it thalassemia, right? If those sequences of amino acids are not normal, they make a disease, thalassemia. If the problem is in the alpha chain, we call it alpha thalassemia. If the problem in the beta chain, we call it beta thalassemia, right? Now here, looking at the heme, in the middle of each polypeptide, you have one molecule of the heme. That is a porphyrin ring, that you see the whole structure of the porphyrin ring here. All those chemicals that connect, all those molecules, atoms that connect to each other, make this molecule. And in the middle of that, you see that you have the ions, right? So the oxygen comes and attaches to this iron, but the carbon dioxide attaches to the polypeptide. Pay attention that we have a huge number, like about 250 million of the hemoglobin inside of each blood cell, something like that. But I'm not sure exactly, about 280 million, something like that, right? Every single red blood cells. And as you see, each hemoglobin can carry how many molecules of the oxygen? 4. Each iron attached to 1. Therefore, we have 4 space for them. And multiply by 280 million, that's a huge capacity of the transporting of the oxygen inside of them. Now, this picture is showing how the red blood cell, after that, we said that it has a limited lifespan, about 120 days. What will happen to the red blood cell? Red blood cell, it gets to the end of the life and it goes under autolysis, right? That the program that cells that we have in the body. But it's not going to go wasted totally. The body recycles the red blood cells and uses many of the components that we have, many of the material that we have inside of them. As you see here, those red blood cells may get into the macrophage here and then just dissolved into the amino acids. Amino acids are go and used in the red blood cell formation in the bone marrow. The heme part of that, the iron gets separated and transferred in the circulation by transferrin. That's why sometimes we measure transferrin to see how many iron we have that is transporting. So it shows the storage of the iron in the body. Those ones also can go into the bone marrow and take part to form the new red blood cells. What about the heme? Those heme, that the rest of the heme makes the biliverdin and finally makes bilirubin that go into the liver, and when they get into the liver, those bilirubin they take part in the forming of the bile salts and finally goes through the biliary system. That later in the digestive system we're talking about the bile and the biliary system, that they finally get into the digestive system and at the end get out of the body, and one part of that get into the kidney and get out of the body through the kidney. And that's just as an indicator that we can measure it in the urine to see that how is the health of the biliary system, for example, already. We don't need to know the details about this recycling of the red blood cells, and just know that it is recycled, right? It's just interesting if you like to know. And this is another resource again for the recycling of and metabolism of the red blood cells, just for your information here. So let's stop here and we continue talking about the different types of the blood type that we have in the body, as the type O, type A, type B, type AB, and positive and negative type of the blood. We're talking about them in the next video. Right, see you later.